Good evening, everybody. Welcome. It is so great to see you. Yeah, it's great to see you again, Glenn. Egon, welcome. So it is such a privilege to invite Klaus to address us tonight. Such a privilege. We've had an interesting second iteration of the Holos Festival, of the Festival of Holism and Evolution, which we're calling the liminal space. The space for imagining new futures, new ways of being. In the first part of the festival, we were looking at the deeper dimensions of holism that were not understood. And in looking at how holism looks at in the world, we thought it would be a good idea to start with Glenn, whose whole focus is on a new system of governance, holistic governance. From there, we went to Dr. Anthony Turton, who looked at the critical issue of our water. And then I did a little bit of research and found that in respect of the greatest impact on this era called the Anthropocene, where our human footprint has been the most impactful on the planet, I found that our food system is the biggest impact. And so nobody better than Klaus Mager knows the food system. Klaus has been in it. He knows it on the inside and the outside. So he's a food systems. And so it is great to invite Klaus, who's going to be looking at how we create regenerative transitions, how we can actually take all the aspects of the food system and make them regenerative rather than extractive. Klaus is the leader of the Food with Thought initiative. And the intriguing part of Klaus's work is how he's using artificial intelligence to help the various sectors in the food system, from the soil to the plate, to actually look at becoming more generative. So Klaus, without much more ado from me, we look forward to your presentation and to having a good generative conversation after that.
Well, thank you for inviting me. So I'm Klaus Mager. I've spent most of my working life inside the food system. I began as a classically trained chef in Germany. I spent 21 years with Disney, eventually serving as a director of food and beverage. And there now I encountered food at a very different scale, complex operations, global supply chains, demanding quality standards, and the daily challenge of feeding large numbers of people reliably. So later I joined Metro AG, one of the world's largest food wholesalers based in Europe, as global head of target group marketing across a business operating in some 30 countries. So that experience gave me a broader view of how farmers, processors, distributors, retailers, restaurants, and consumers are connected, and how decisions made in one part of the system create consequences somewhere else. Since retiring from corporate life, I found myself increasingly working on the intersection of food, agriculture, climate change, and environmental decline. More recently, I found Food with Thought AI, an initiative exploring how artificial intelligence might support a regenerative transition, not simply by improving individual farming practices, but by helping us understand and coordinate the food system as a whole. That brings me directly to the spirit of this gathering and to the work of Jan Smuts. Can we go to slide 2, please? Holism asks us to see that the parts cannot be fully understood in isolation from the whole. A farm cannot be separated from its watershed, its soil, its market, or its community. Humanity cannot be separated from nature. We're not standing outside the living world, managing it from a distance. We are embedded within it, dependent upon it, and participating in it. That recognition, moving beyond the illusion of separation, is the starting point for what I would like to explore with you today. So a food system is a living network connecting soil organisms, plants, animals, water, and climate with farmers, workers, businesses, governments, and communities. It is a civilization's relationship with the living world, made visible 3 times a day. Every meal carries the condition of the soil in which it began, the water used to grow it, the energy required to process and move it, the labor of those who produced it, and the economic rules that determined what was grown. Holism asks us that the whole to see that whole before optimizing its parts. Modern food systems largely did the opposite. Breeders optimized for yield and uniformities. Farmers were pushed to maximize production. Processors optimized shelf life. Distributors speed and volume. Retailers availability and price. And these achievements were real. They fed a growing population, reduced seasonal scarcity, and made a wide range of foods available. But each part was judged by its own narrow measure of success. A crop could deliver record yields, while the soil lost organic matter. A supply chain could lower prices, while the farmer received a smaller share. A product could remain saleable for months, while offering little nourishment. A region could increase output, while its rivers filled with nutrients and chemicals. The parts appeared successful even as the system grew more fragile. This is fragmentation made physical. Soil became an agricultural issue. Water became an environmental issue. Farmer viability became an economic issue. Nutrition became a public health issue. Climate became an emissions issue. Biodiversity became a conservation issue. But in the living world, these were never separate. Soil structure determines whether rain enters the ground or runs across it, shaping erosion, water quality, groundwater recharge, and drought resilience. Plant diversity above ground influences biological diversity below it, affecting nutrient cycling, plant health, and the need for external inputs. Food prices shape what farmers can afford to do. Markets shape the crops farmers grow, and those crops shape the landscape. The relationships remain connected whether institutions recognize them or not. When
Klaus,
we separate them.
are you giving Echon instructions to move on to the next slide?
Yeah, I will. We're still on slide 2.
Oh, you'll do that. Okay, good.
Yeah.
Thank
When we
you.
separate them, the costs do not disappear. They are transferred to farmers through declining soil, to communities through polluted water, and to the public through health systems, disaster relief, and ecosystem repair. We call these externalities costs left outside the transition, but they're not outside the system. They're only outside the price. This creates the central contradiction of the transition. We ask farmers to protect water, rebuild soil, support biodiversity, store carbon, grow nutritious food, and sustain rural communities. But markets pay them for something much narrower, a standardized commodity delivered at a competitive price. A farmer who invests in cover crops, longer rotations, habitat, or more careful grazing may create value for the whole landscape. Yet little of that value returns to the farm. Meanwhile, debt, labor costs, equipment payments, and bio requirements remain. The food system crisis is therefore not primarily a failure of farming knowledge. It is a failure to organize markets, finance, and institutions around the living conditions on which food production depends. The farmer is not the bottleneck. The bottleneck is the system of incentives, institutions, and relationships around the farmer. Can we go to slide 3, please? The fracture I have described is not unique to the modern food system. History repeatedly shows that societies become vulnerable when they weaken the ecological foundation that sustained them. Soil loses fertility, forests retract, irrigation systems accumulate salt, water becomes scarce or unreliable, agricultural production becomes less able to absorb drought, flood, or political disruption. Ancient Mesopotamia offers one example. Irrigation along the Tigris and the Euphrates made cities and highly productive agriculture possible in an arid landscape. But when drainage was insufficient, evaporation left salts behind. Over time, some areas became less suitable to grow crops. Among the classic Maya, prolonged drought, pressure on forests and soils, population demands, warfare, and political instability appear to have reinforced one another. Some city-states lost populations and authority, while others adapted or continued. The American Dust Bowl reveals the same pattern in modern form. Severe drought struck the Great Plains after large areas of native grassland had been plowed. With the vegetation and root systems that once held the soil gone, wind lifted exposed topsoil into enormous dust storms. Climate variability, farming practice, land policy, and economic pressure combined to create a disaster no single factor explains. Across these different histories, ecological degradation reduced society's room to maneuver. A drought that might once have been manageable became a crisis. A harvest failure became migration, conflict, or political instability. The difference today is scale. The food economy is globally interconnected. A relatively small number of producing regions supply international commodity markets. Fertilizer, animal feed, energy, finance, and shipping connect farms thousands of miles apart. At the same time, many regions are experiencing soil degradation, water stress, and climate disruption together. History does not tell us that collapse is inevitable. It tells us that adaptive capacity depends on recognizing these relationships before ecological decline removes our choices. Can we go to slide 4, please? History is not only a record of ecological failure. Now, across the world, many cultures developed food systems that kept feedback from the land visible. People could see when water was becoming scarce, when a hillside was losing soil, when grazing pressure was too high, or when fertility needed to be restored. Their response was not based on the modern language of sustainability. It was based on necessity, observation, and accumulated experience. Mixed farming, rotations, terraces, water harvesting, composting, managed grazing, and the integration of crops and livestock kept nutrients in circulation, spread risk, and maintained the productive capacity of place. These cultures also did not separate agriculture from cuisine. Cuisine became a form of ecological memory, a living record of what a landscape could reliably produce, in which season, and in what combination. Japan's traditional Satuyama landscapes illustrate this. Forests, rice fields, grasslands, irrigation ponds, coastal waters, farming and fishing were managed in connected systems. In the Mediterranean, another form of intelligence evolved around dry summers, variable rainfall, in thin or sloping soils, terraces, dry stone walls, mixed crops, grazing and water channels, slowed runoff and protected land, grains, legumes, vegetables, olive oil, fruit, cheese, cured foods, and preserved vegetables turned seasonal abundance into nourishment through periods of scarcity. Much of what we admire as Mediterranean cuisine is a history of communities learning to create pleasure from ecological limits. The Three Sisters, maize, beans, and squash, offer a different example. The maize gave the beans support. The beans contributed biologically fixed nitrogen. The squash covered the soil, retaining moisture and suppressing competing plants. The ecological relationship became a culinary relationship as well, complementary in the field and on the plate, the Mexican cuisine. The point is not that earlier cultures lived in perfect balance with nature. They did not. What matters are the design principles embedded within them. They worked with diversity rather than uniformity. They recycled nutrients. They adapted to water and terrain. They connected production with seasonality. And they preserved knowledge through food, ritual, and shared practice. Cuisine, viewed in this way, is more than taste or identity. It's a culture's memory of how to inhabit a place. The task is not to return nostalgically to an earlier world. It is to recover the sensitivity to ecological feedback and combine it with modern science, technology, and social expectations. Can we go to slide 5, please? To understand why regeneration must begin with place, we first have to change how we see soil. For much of the industrial area, soil has been treated as an inert growing medium, something that holds plants upright while nutrients, water, and protection are supplied from outside. But soil is not dirt. Soil is a living system. In healthy soil, minerals, organic matter, water, air, roots, and organisms continually interact. Bacteria and fungi decompose organic material and release nutrients. Roots feed microbial communities. Fungal networks extend their reach. Insects and other organisms create channel and move material. Together, these relationships create soil structure and function. When rain falls on well-structured soil, much of it moves downward rather than across the surface. Some becomes available to plants. Some travels slowly through the landscape, recharging groundwater and sustaining streams. When soil structure is damaged, the same rain behaves differently. The surface seals or compacts. Water runs off, carrying soil nutrients and chemicals into waterways. Rain that should replenish the land becomes an erosion event. So soil health, water security, and climate resilience are not separate concerns. They are expressions of the same relationship. Living soil also changes the meaning of fertility. Fertility is not simply a stock of chemicals. It's the soil's capacity to cycle nutrients, store carbon, receive water, and sustain the biological relationships through which plants obtain what they need. The question is therefore not only what does the crop require this season, it is also what is happening to the soil's capacity to function over the next 10, 50, or 100 years. Every soil answers differently. Soils are shaped by geology, climate, vegetation, topography, water management, and time. Even neighboring fields may differ in history, compaction, organic matter, infiltration, and recovery potential. This is why regeneration cannot be reduced to a universal checklist. Cover crops may help, but which species, under what rainfall, with what machinery, and within which market rotation? Reduced tillage may protect one soil, while another requires carefully managed disturbance. Livestock can cycle nutrients and stimulate growth, but poorly timed grazing can have the opposite effect. The practice alone is not regenerative. Its effect depends on how it interacts with the whole system. This leads towards bioregional thinking. A bioregion is a landscape shaped by shared soils, water flows, climate, ecosystems, and human communities, not merely an administrative boundary. Thinking bioregionally means asking how a farm participates in the larger living system. Where does its water come from? Where does it go? Which crops, animals, and trees fit the climate? What processing markets, cuisine, and knowledge exist nearby? Regeneration begins with a grounded question. What does this place need to become more alive, resilient, and capable of nourishing its community over time? Can you go to slide 6, please? If living soil is where regeneration begins, it is also what the modern food system learned to replace from the outside. To understand the transition ahead, we need to understand the bargain we left behind, or we are leaving behind. Nitrogen is essential to plant growth. Although the atmosphere is nearly 80% nitrogen, most plants cannot use it directly. For most of agricultural history, usable nitrogen circulated through local biological cycles: legumes, manure, compost, crop residues, and soil organisms. In the early 20th century, Fritz Haber found a way to combine atmospheric nitrogen with hydrogen to produce ammonia. Carl Bosch then developed the engineering process to manufacture it continuously at industrial scale. Haber solved the chemistry, Bosch solved the scaling. The consequences were extraordinary. Farmers were no longer limited to nitrogen recycled locally or fixed biologically. Fertility could be manufactured elsewhere, transported and applied in concentrated form. Combined with irrigation, mechanization, plant breeding, and crop protection, synthetic fertilizer greatly increased cereal yields, supported population growth, and reduced pressure to cultivate more land. This was not a bad technology displacing a good one. It was a rational response to hunger, scarcity, and unreliable harvests. Humanity became deeply dependent on its success, but every bargain has terms. Synthetic nitrogen made farms less dependent on local nutrient cycles. Lost nutrients should be replaced from outside. This enables specialization, large landscapes planted to one crop, livestock separated from crop production, and nutrients concentrated as waste rather than returned as fertility. The circular metabolism of the farm became increasingly linear. Natural gas and minerals entered at one end, standardized commodities left at the other, and excess nutrients escaped into water and the atmosphere. At the same time, yield became the dominant measure of success. Yield matters. A system that does not produce enough food cannot succeed. But yield measures output, not the conditions of the system producing it. A field can deliver high yields while losing organic matter. It can remain profitable while becoming less able to absorb water and more dependent on fertilizer, irrigation, pesticides, borrowed capital, and favorable weather. As yield became the organizing number, breeding, machinery, storage, insurance, commodity markets, and procurement adapted around large volumes of uniform products. Uniformity lowered costs and moved food efficiently, but biological systems do not necessarily thrive on uniformity. Large areas of one crop favor particular pests and diseases. Short rotations remove ecological breaks. Chemical control may work until weeds, insects, or pathogens adapt, requiring another intervention. This is not a criticism of farmers. They operate within markets that reward predictable yields and punish failure immediately. The economic model rewards control because the crop must be protected this season. The technology was not the mistake. The mistake was allowing yield to become the definition of success. The question is whether we can retain the contribution of industrial nitrogen and modern economy to food security while reducing the dependency, pollution, and ecological simplification that developed around them. Can we go to slide 7, please? The problem is not one chemical machine or practice. It is the reinforcing loop that forms when several individually rational decisions begin to weaken the land's biological capacity. A reinforcing loop feeds on itself. One change creates conditions that encourage more of the same. In agriculture, the loop often begins with simplification. Rotations shorten. Livestock and crops are separated. Fields remain bare longer. Soil is disturbed repeatedly. Nutrients are applied mainly in soluble form, while pests and weeds are managed primarily through petrochemical control. Each decision may make sense in isolation. Together, however, they can reduce diversity above and below ground. Plants are the main source of energy entering the soil ecosystem. Through photosynthesis, they convert sunlight into carbon compounds, some of which moves through roots into the soil and feed bacteria, fungi, and other organisms. When living roots are present for only part of the year, that energy flow becomes intermittent. When crop diversity declines, so does the variety of compounds entering the soil. Repeated disturbance can break aggregates, disrupt fungal networks, and accelerate the loss of organic matter. Fertilizers and pesticides may alter biological communities when product, rate, or timing is poorly matched to the system. This does not mean every application destroys soil biology. The effect depends on context. The important point is cumulative. Here, Smuts' insight becomes concrete. Soil function emerges from relationships among organisms, roots, minerals, water, and management. It cannot be located in any one component because it belongs to the functioning whole. When biological diversity, living roots, organic matter, and protective cover decline together, soil structure weakens. The surface may crust, compacted layers form, and rain that once entered the ground now evaporates or runs downhill, carrying soil and nutrients with it. The farm has not merely lost water, it has lost fertility and future productive capacity. Downstream, the same event contributes to sedimentation, pollution, and flooding. A field problem becomes a watershed problem. The remaining soil also holds less plant available water. A field may receive the same annual rainfall, yet suffer greater drought stress because less water enters and remains. During dry periods, crops run out sooner. During heavy rain, the land is less able to absorb it. The system becomes vulnerable at both extremes. That vulnerability drives another round of intervention. More irrigation, more fertilizer, crop protections, and financial risk management. The farm becomes more dependent on purchased inputs precisely because its internal capacity to regulate itself has weakened. Ecological fragility becomes economic fragility. With debt and contracts too, experimentation becomes harder. The safest choice this season may be the familiar crop and another input. That decision is rational, but repeated across the system, it deepens long-term dependency. The issue is not that external inputs are always wrong. They may be necessary, especially during transition. The deeper question is whether an intervention restores the system's capacity to function or substitutes for that capacity indefinitely. A regenerative system is not one in which human intervention disappears. It is one in which intervention increasingly supports the land's capacity to organize, recover, and remain productive. Can we go to slide 8? The loop often remains hidden while the inputs continue to arrive. A farmer orders fertilizer, the dealer delivers it, the crop is planted. From the field, the system may appear local, but the nitrogen applied in that field may depend on natural gas extracted in another country, ammonia manufactured in a large industrial facility, ships passing through a narrow maritime corridor, international finance, insurance, and a distribution network spanning several continents. The 2026 disruption around the Strait of Hormuz made that architecture visible. Under normal conditions, the strait carries between 20 and 30% of globally traded fertilizer, along with major energy flows. When passage became uncertain, shipping delays, insurance costs, interrupted gas supplies, and market anxiety affected prices far beyond the Gulf. A farmer thousands of miles away may pay more even if their fertilizer never passed through Hormuz because local prices are connected to global market. This reveals that fertilizer is not merely another farm input. It is strategic infrastructure for modern food security. A widely cited 2008 study estimated that synthetic nitrogen produced through the Haber-Bosch process was responsible for feeding about 48% of the world's population at that time. Let's sit with that statistic for a moment here. What it is saying is that 1/2 of today's global population could not be alive if it wasn't for the input of petrochemicals into our production process. The precise percentage changes with population, diets, and agricultural practice, but the conclusion remains: modern civilization is profoundly dependent on industrial nitrogen fixation. That dependency operates at several levels. We depend on the chemistry that converts atmospheric nitrogen into ammonia, on large amounts of energy, on a concentrated network of production facilities, on shipping routes, ports, finance, and political stability, and on farmers being able to purchase fertilizer at a price that still allows them to grow crop profitably. A shock at the beginning of the chain travels through the whole system. Conflict affects shipping. Shipping affects fertilizer availability and price. Fertilizer prices affect planting decisions and farm finances. Those decisions affect yields, commodity markets, and eventually the cost and availability of food. The lesson is not that we can simply stop using synthetic nitrogen. Abrupt removal before rebuilding biological fertility and redesigning production would create enormous food security risks. Nor is fertilizer itself the enemy. The lesson is that one pathway has become too dominant. Resilient means rebuilding options, using nitrogen more efficiently, recovering nutrients from waste streams, bringing legumes in diverse rotations back into farming systems, strengthening soil biology, and expanding lower carbon fertilizer production where appropriate. The objective is not the abrupt removal of an input. It is the reduction of dangerous dependency. Recognizing the fragility is one thing. Giving farmers the economic freedom to move away from it is yet another. Can we go to slide 9? Farmers are often told that the regenerative transition is mainly a question of awareness or willingness. But the main barrier is usually not attitude. It is the economic system in which the farm must survive. A farmer rarely has the freedom to redesign from first principles. Equipment, debt, contracts, insurance, labor, existing buyers all narrow the available choices. Lenders may expect familiar rotations. Processors and elevators may accept only a limited range of commodities. Government policy reinforces this structure. Farm bills, crop insurance, commodity supports, research and infrastructure have largely been built around major crops and established production systems. They reduce risk inside the industrial model while offering less protection for diversified rotations, unfamiliar crops, and regenerative transition. This is not simply a free market favoring the status quo. Public policy has helped determine which risks are protected, which crops have markets, and which systems appear economically viable. Transition requires new knowledge. Management and sometimes equipment costs may rise, labor may increase, and yields may become less predictable. Diverse rotations may include crops without dependable bias. Many benefits, better soil structure, lower input dependency, and improved water retention take years to develop. This creates the transition valley. On one side is the existing system. It may be ecologically fragile, but lenders, insurers, advisors, processors, government programs, and commodity markets are already organized around it. On the other side is a potentially more resilient farm with healthier soil, better water retention, and lower dependency on purchased inputs. Between them lies a period of added cost, uncertainty, and risk. The farmer may not know how long it will last, whether yields will hold, or whether anyone will buy the crops needed to make the new system work. This is where dominant markets become a trap. Commodity markets pay mainly for volume, uniformity, and delivery. They rarely distinguish between a crop grown while rebuilding soil and one grown while depleting it. The farmer carries the transition cost, while markets and policy continue to support the system being left behind. Many benefits also fall outside the farm's financial statement. Better water infiltration can reduce downstream flooding and improve water quality, reduce pollution. Biodiversity benefits society. Lower dependency on imported fertilizers strengthens the wider food system. The costs are private. Many benefits are public. Under these conditions, remaining with the existing system may be the rational choice for the farmer. The farmer must survive this season to exist 20 years from now. Knowledge matters, but it does not remove financial exposure, create a buyer, or change the terms of a loan or insurance policy. So the question is not what is wrong with the farmer. It is why markets and policy expect farmers to carry the transition risk while failing to reward the value created when land is restored. The farmer is being asked to cross the transition valley. Is the rest of the system prepared to build the bridge? Can we go to slide 10, please? If farmers are expected to cross the transition valley, someone must be waiting on the other side with dependable demand. I suggest institutional procurement not only as a complete solution, not as a complete solution to the global food system, but as one concrete example of how the rules surrounding farmers can be reorganized at a scale where coordinated action is possible. Local food systems matter. Farmers markets, commodity-supported agriculture, community-supported agriculture, CSAs, and direct sales can return a larger share of the food dollar to producers, strengthening trust and keep value circulating within the region. They are laboratories for a different relationship among farmers, eater, and place. But they do not solve the problem at scale. Most food, in fact, over 98%, of all food moves through supermarkets, distributors, restaurants, institutions, and public food programs. Direct markets also require time, labor, transport, and sales skills, and they're often most accessible to people with disposable income, mobility, time, and cooking capacity. If regenerative food remains mainly a premium lifestyle choice, it may create valuable niches without transforming the wider system. The larger demand level lies with institutions, schools, hospitals, universities, care facilities, prisons, government food programs, and corporate dining operations. They purchase large quantities of food every day. Unlike an individual consumer, an institutional buyer can offer volume, continuity, and predictable contracts. That matters to farmers. A farmer deciding to diversify a rotation needs to know who will buy the crop in what quantity, at what specification, at what price, and for how many years. Predictable demand can reduce transition risk. It can support crop planning, equipment investment, and cooperation among farms. It can also support the infrastructure between farm and institutions, aggregation, storage, washing, processing, distribution, and logistics. Institutions can therefore reshape landscapes through procurement. A school district that commits to purchasing regionally grown grains, legumes, vegetables, or meat is not simply changing a menu. It is sending a signal upstream. If you grow this food under these conditions, there will be a market for it. But institutions are constrained too. Schools operate under reimbursement rates. Hospitals and universities may have long-term food service contracts. Procurement rules may favor the lowest bid. Kitchens may lack staff or equipment. Smaller farms may not meet volume, packing, or documentation requirements. So the task is not merely persuading institutions to care more. It is designing a supply system that lets them act without exceeding budgets or disrupting operations. We also cannot build regeneration by asking low-income households to pay the full transition cost. If society values healthier soil, cleaner water, rural viability, and nourishing food, part of that value must be financed outside the household grocery bill. Institutional demand can be an anchor, but between the farmer willing to produce differently and the institution willing to buy differently lies a missing bridge. Can we go to slide 11? Intention alone does not move food. A farmer may want to diversify, and a hospital may want to support regional regenerative production. But unless demand, risk, and coordination are addressed together, those intentions rarely meet. The bridge has three interconnected parts. The first is dependable demand. Institutions can become anchor buyers, giving farmers confidence that the market will exist before they plant. But the commitment must go beyond saying we support local and regenerative agriculture. Farmers need to know what will be purchased, in what volume, at what quality, and what schedule, and at what price. The second part is price and risk support. Transition initially costs more as farmers rebuild soil function, learn new management, and absorb uncertainty. If institutions carry the full cost, they may not be able to afford the food. If farmers carry it, transition may never start. Risk can be shared through patient loans, cost sharing, adapted insurance, minimum price contracts, and transition finance. Support can also recognize benefits that do not appear in the crop price. Improved water quality, reduced flooding, biodiversity, reduced nitrogen in the water, greater climate resilience. Payments for these ecosystem services are imperfect. Their purpose should not be to commodify nature, but to redirect some of what society spends on pollution, on water treatment, and disaster recovery towards prevention and restoration. The third, can you go to slide 12, please? The third part is coordination, the missing middle. A school cannot buy regeneration in the abstract. It needs food washed, processed, packed, delivered, and invoiced to specification. Aggregation allows several farms to meet institutional volumes. Processing makes regional crops usable in commercial kitchens. Storage extends the season. Coordinated crop planning prevents surpluses and shortages. Contracts and logistics allocate responsibility and keep food moving reliably. Measurement is also necessary. Buyers, governments, and investors need credible evidence of soil, water, and biodiversity outcomes, but reporting must support the transition rather than overwhelm farmers with paperwork. Wherever possible, one credible set of observations should meet multiple requirements. So, for example, just measuring the nitrogen content of water flowing out from the farm is one such requirement that has multiple regenerative impacts for the farm itself. Maybe we can discuss later. Carefully governed artificial intelligence may help match supply and demand, coordinate crop plans, identify logistic gaps, organize contracts, and translate environmental data into usable information. AI is not the bridge, it's a tool for building and operating it. Demand without infrastructure creates disappointment. Finance without markets creates temporary projects. Measurement without viable farm economics creates paperwork. When dependable demand, shared risk, and coordination reinforce one another, regeneration becomes an economic relationship rather than an aspiration. Can we go to slide 13, please? We have followed the system from soil biology to global supply chains and from the farmer's field to procurement, finance, and public policy. The final question is one of direction. Public policy responds to the food system one problem at a time. We find efficiency, disaster recovery, insurance, irrigation, technology, and infrastructure. Many interventions are necessary, but a collection of useful interventions does not automatically become a transition. Without a shared direction, policy may help the existing system endure its problems without changing the conditions that produce them. We may apply fertilizer more efficiently without reducing structural dependency on it. We may improve irrigation by withdrawing more water than a watershed can replenish, or we ensure farmers against severe losses without restoring the landscape functions that reduce exposure. We may help the system cope without helping it heal. This is why policy needs a compass. A compass is not a rigid blueprint. Agriculture is too diverse, place-specific, and dynamic for one universal prescription. A compass simply tells us the direction in which the whole system should move. Does this investment increase or reduce dependency on vulnerable inputs? Does it improve the soil's capacity to receive and retain water? Does it diversify the biological and economic system? Does it strengthen the farmer's ability to adapt? Does it improve access to nourishing food? Does it restore the living foundation on which future production depends? These questions allow many different policies and practices to contribute to a coherent direction. Without them, we risk mistaking activities for progress. I recently reviewed a list of measures assembled around the 2026 Farm Bill by the Senate, 155 measures, and left with many defensible answers, but no sufficiently clear common question. What kind of food system are we trying to create as water becomes less reliable climate extremes intensify, and input markets become more volatile? Are we financing the continued operation of a vulnerable system, or deliberately building a more regenerative one? And when you look at the 155 measures in the current Farm Bill proposal by the Senate, they're completely random. There is no overarching direction that the system is taking. Technology presents the same challenge. Precision agriculture can place seed more accurately and apply fertilizer, pesticides, and water in smaller quantities in more exact locations. Sensors, satellites, robotics, and artificial intelligence can reduce waste, lower costs, and reveal fields in new ways. But precision is not purpose. A system can become extremely precise while moving in the wrong direction. Technology can optimize a monoculture, accelerate groundwater extraction, or apply an input with remarkable accuracy. That may make the model more efficient without making it healthier. The essential question is precise in service of what? If technology serves yield and short-term returns, it may reinforce the existing system. If it serves soil function, water resilience, nutrient cycling, farmer viability, and nourishment, it can become a partner in regeneration. The same tool can support extraction or renewal. Purpose determines the outcome. Production matters. We must protect food security through any transition. But the deeper purpose is to maintain and restore the living capacity from which production comes. This brings us back to soil and water. Imagine rain falling on two fields. Can we go to slide 14, please? On one field, the soil is bare, compacted and biologically dependent. Rain strikes the surface, the soil seals, and water moves sideways, carrying sediments and nutrients with it. The field has received rain, but the land has not been able to receive it. On the other field, living roots are present. The surface is protected. Organic matter and biological activity have created pores and aggregates. Rain slows, enters the soil, supports roots and microbial life, and moves gradually through the landscape. The same rain falls on both fields, but only one can turn that rain into fertility, resilience, and future life. That, for me, is the image of regeneration, not simply higher yield, not a certification label, not one practice imposed everywhere. Regeneration is the recovery of relationship, soil receiving water, plants feeding soil, animals returning nutrients, farmers receiving a viable return, communities receiving nourishing food, and policy recognizing that these are not separate outcomes, but expressions of one whole. Smuts describe wholes not as a collections of parts, but as living formations capable of greater complexity and integration. The food system became fragmented. Can we go to slide 15, please? The food system became fragmented because we learned to see and reward its parts separately. Regeneration brings them back into relationship, not by returning to the past, not by combining ecological memory, modern science, but by combining ecological memory, modern science, appropriate technology, and shared responsibility. Regeneration begins when the land can receive rain again, when farmers no longer carry the transition alone, when food prices recognize the conditions that make future food possible, when policy acquires a compass. That is not merely agriculture improving, it is the whole returning. Thank you. So that was my
Well,
talk.
well,
And my
Klaus,
electricity is back on.
thank you so much. Thank you so much. Let's just take a moment just to reflect, particularly on the notion of the mindset shift that is required for holism. Not only understanding it philosophically, but what it is actually saying. And Klaus, you described that so graphically, the kind of thinking and response. There is a very interesting question from Mark Pearson, who is an authority in system dynamics. Mark, would you like to ask your question?
Sorry, before Claudius, shall I stop sharing or do we need the slides?
I wonder.
No, don't. We can
Shall-
stop.
Okay.
We can keep it there and then we can move back and forth if people request that.
Yeah, that's fine for me. Okay.
Okay. Mark?
Well, that was a tour de force that I appreciate and kind of live with every day. And the thing I'd like your opinion on is at what different scales, and by that I don't just mean geographic scales, but political scales, do you anticipate or hope that the different aspects of the problem, as you've so well described it, could be handled and should be handled? And I'm a huge advocate of Ashby's Law. I wish I'd learned it in grade school. Anyway, that's the question, because I think you've laid out the situation very well, and I think Ostrom's idea of polycentric governance will have something to do with how your discourse could be made actionable.
Well, I've been observing the political process for a number of years. You know, I joined Citizen Climate Lobby, I don't know, 10 years ago, and went to Washington a couple of times for lobbying meetings, and I'm also with the Sierra Club on the Federal Policy Advisory subcommittee there. So I'm familiar with the political process, but I must say that the food system is as stuck as is the energy system. You know, it's dominated by the same petrochemical interests. The status quo inertia is amazingly strong. The changes that have been made and that now we are now dealing with is that the current administration has laid off over 2,400 field representatives from USDA that were supporting local farmers to apply for grants, to get linked up with scientists and support particularly local food systems, food hubs, food banks, and so on. So they cut the budget by an enormous amount, from like 900 million to 150 million is the last number I've seen. I don't know where it will end up, but these cuts are going into the other direction.
Let me restate the question now that I hear your response. What is the smallest scale at which something significant could be done?
The smallest scale is to work local at community level because there is simply not one recipe for a regenerative conversion that fits everywhere. No, you cannot apply the same ideas in Kansas as you do in Oregon or Florida because you're dealing watershed specific, bioregion specific, and so you can use the same design principles, right? But you have to apply them locally.
Thank you. Perfect. That's the answer I was hoping you would say.
Mark, I see your hand.
Yeah, that's great. Please make sure you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think I'm following on from Mark Pearson's question, which is really, where do we start? So I think, Klaus, I'd like to know, in your opinion, what do you see as like a primary driver, like the one thing that could, I know it's obviously a whole bunch of things that need to happen for this all to happen, but how does one seed it? How does one start it? It's very interestingly, just a comment I'd like to add on top of that. I've got a very, very good friend that has been in regenerative agriculture for 35 years, still struggling to pay her rent every month, simply because I think she's, wanting to help farmers that are willing to go through that transition and can't find any. So it's like little tiny government programs, it's little tiny like organic wine farms and things that are, maybe interested in looking at this. So just compounding a last thought on that, is I was looking at the Earth Constitution and I said to Claude AI, where do we start? And Claude was like, well, the consumer needs to see immediate benefits in order for them to make a decision and a choice, for example, to join or to support or to fund something like that. Yeah, so those are just a couple of thoughts around where do we start as my question. I'd like your personal opinion.
Well, the point I was trying to make is that there's not one single place to start. You need to start in multiple places because it's a systems decision. So the consumer, for example, is constrained by purchasing power. So you may want to buy farmers market products, but you can't pay $2 for a tomato. Right? So the most fragile parts of the economy are the least able to access, this locally grown food because there is a cost difference there, and the cost difference is baked into the way the system is set up because the individual farmer cannot compete with an industrial production system. That is much cheaper. So it requires multiple components. But what I was trying to express also is that this cost differential between this regenerative transition and what the market can bear to pay requires a secondary revenue stream for the farmer. And so there is this idea of quantifying ecosystem services and create a stack of what the farmer is improving in terms of ecosystems and tokenize that and put a value on it. So, for example, there is a group on the Mississippi River shed there. The community has had to deal with nitrogen pollution in the water. So they set up an incentive system for the farmers to reduce the nitrogen outflow, and they quantified that and pay farmers to reduce nitrogen outflow from their farms. Well, when you think about this, how do you reduce nitrogen outflow? You have to put on a cover crop. You may have to rotate your crops. You may have to apply precision agriculture. So you're doing a lot of things that are regenerative in nature with one measurement, right? And that made it worthwhile for these farmers to go invest, and they still came out ahead because now they're reducing their chemical inputs and all of that. So the creation of a secondary revenue stream is extremely important to find a way to finance this transition. And by the way, you look at any of the big companies, whether that's Walmart or Kellogg, Pepsi, they all have made multi-million-dollar commitments, to support a regenerative transition, but there is no vehicle, where they can really invest reliably under MRV standards, measurement, report, verification. And that's what we can do with AI. We can build these systems with artificial intelligence support.
Erhan.
Yes, thank you. Well, thank you, Klaus, for your story, and by the way, also your beautifully designed slides. I have a question which actually I would like to also involve into that question Dr. Glenn Martin, who is also here, which is on the issue of governance, and it has already been raised, I think, by Mark and Mark. So how does this work when we talk about bioregioning on the one hand, which is basically shaped by land, by natural borders, you can say, by watersheds, and on the other hand, nation states that are focused on GDP, where the whole bioregioning idea, I think, is more on how do you create the right conditions for life. Now, where does this come together? And Dr. Glenn Martin, you've been working on the new constitution, a provisional. Maybe you can share something if this is also in the ideas of what you are working on, or is it something you're looking at? Maybe first question to Dr. Glenn Martin for that.
Yes, I think Klaus's presentation was really excellent and very insightful. the interconnectedness of things. Uh, but and it occurred to me while the presentation was going on that this kind of interconnectedness is also characteristic of the ecological structure of the planet itself, the Gaia idea, in which air and water and energy input from the sun and the constant interaction of minerals, the erosion of rocks, the entire planetary ecosystem needs regenerating. It needs to be protected. And the regenerative agriculture is a subsection of the whole that needs to be embraced and protected. And at the same time, the parts, the very excellent characterization by Klaus of the problems a farmer faces when the farmer wants to use regenerative practices and requires a secondary income to make that possible, because it cannot be accomplished simply by the dominant capitalist pricing system that is now in place. All of this, in my view, requires a global perspective, a global common good that is moderated by global government, democratic world government. And the very structure of the nation state is not going to make that possible. It's wonderful that Klaus is in Washington, D.C., but Washington, D.C. is also the source of the industrial military complex. It's also the source of wars going on around the planet. And the clash and the incapacity of nation states in the world to form a common program. Even the UN system of sustainable development, the Sustainable Development Goals. If I've written extensively about that, and if one goes into the analysis of how these are going to be paid for, which comes out in the final goal in Article 17, nothing really changes. And therefore, the very admirable first 16 goals cannot be accomplished because the system, the Sustainable Development Goals, do not question the world system itself of competitive nation states and global capitalism, which has no concern with regenerative principles, but only with commodification for the purpose of private profit. So I think it's very important that we think globally, literally, in all dimensions, environmentally, politically, economically. And I think ultimately, if we're going to have a future on this planet, that common good has to be under democratic world law. So anyway, Mark, I don't know if you have thoughts about this or if you encountered it, but I mean, Klaus, I don't know if you've had thoughts about it or encountered it, but I'd be interested to hear your response to what I've been saying.
Yeah, I mean, I understand your nation state's concerns, but I do think that today we are far more dominated by globally operating companies, and that the real power and ability to make change really rests there. So I was working as a global head of target group marketing for Metro AG, which is a European-based, a German-based, a German company. We were operating in 30 countries. Our mission was to localize our assortment So that means we had 700 locations in 30 countries. And even within, let's say, just Germany or Italy or any of those countries, we would have a store in Berlin that had a completely different assortment than the one in Düsseldorf, right? Because and it respected local producers. And in fact, I remember we got in trouble with one store in one location because we failed to source from a local dairy. And the locals refused to buy anything from Metro until we put that local dairy onto the shelf. So you because the Europeans are far more conscious, of their regional food systems and so on. So
Yeah.
there is no reason why, Walmart, for example, or any of these large companies couldn't localize their assortment. And so when Whole Foods came out as an example, they they allowed the store manager to source up to 20% of SKUs from the local market. And then they wiped them out, because that was just challenging the entire system. So there has to be a mind change, not so much in the government, but in the corporate sector, where they come on board and support that. Um, and of course that's more expensive. The more you decentralize your procurement system, the more people you need, and the more money it costs, the more contracts you have to sign and develop. But I think that's where the hang up is. And so from within the regenerative movement, we have to make it easy, for CPG manufacturers and national wholesale retailers to source local and develop a support structure for that.
Well, Michael Stock.
Thank you. Thank you, Claudius. I'm about halfway through Eco-Civilization, and I'm at the middle of the book where what Jeremy Lent asks is, what does farming need from us? How can we sort of put back what has been lost? But the question I wanted to ask Klaus was particularly about Europe. And you may well know a lot about this. The EU, through the mechanism of the CAP, rewards farmers for soil, for health. And I just wondered what your experience was of the effectiveness of the EU common agricultural policy for rewarding farmers for improving the health of their soils. Is it working?
Well, I have not paid attention to the regulatory process while I was in Europe, because I was working at the wholesale level, and in a more broad context. But what I can say is that the political process in Europe, in general, the EU, is protecting local producers, right? They have a very strong antitrust law, so they prevent consolidation across bioregions, for example. So even when you have companies buy up local producers, they have to maintain them. They don't close them down, right? So I would say overall, the mindset, the worldview of the EU is favorable to the farmer and to the and respecting the local food systems. And when you think about it, how important this is for tourism, right? And just for the general well-being. I mean, Italy is famous for its cuisine. You go from one watershed to the next, and you have a completely different menu, and local specialties and all of that. And the same in France and Germany and Spain and so on. So those are precious cultural elements that the Europeans are conscious of and want to preserve. That was my general observation. And here in the US, we have like no respect for any of that.
Well, forgive me, I won't make any comments about the situation in the United States. But what I do want to do is to say something which is very serious, I think. And there are two things which are worth emphasizing. The first is that Haber-Bosch allowed the population of the world to go from about 2 billion to about 8 billion. And so it is an extraordinary example of a trap where we have taken a short-term advantage from effectively oil and turned it into the most enormous risk. And on the question of the risk, you may know of the work done by the University of Exeter in the UK only 2 years ago on behalf of the British insurance industry, which looked forward only to 2050. And the two scenarios that they looked at was a sort of temperature rise of 2 degrees and the other of 3 degrees. The impact on the carrying capacity of the Earth was horrific. At 2 degrees, we will lose 2 billion people. At 3 degrees, we will lose 4 billion people. I wanted to join this event because I think it is maybe one of the most important that Just Holos have hosted, because it is about the extinction and the loss of lives of billions of people this century because of starvation and fire and flood and famine.
You know, Michael, you said what I wanted to say. This is the reason the Holos Initiative exists, to support that mindset shift. And then this is why this liminal space exists, so we can explore with people like Klaus, with people like Glenn. Joshua.
He hasn't responded.
Did you want to respond, Klaus?
Yeah, no, I mean, the carrying capacity of the Earth, if we are living in in harmony with the environment, is below 3 billion, maybe 2.5 billion or so, right? And the boost from to the 8.3 or whatever we are right now. I mean, I was born in 1949. There were 2.4 billion people. In 1960, 3 billion. In 2000, 6 billion. Now we're at 8.3. It's unsustainable. But the enormous difficulty of transitioning back into engaging with nature, and to prevent further degradation of the natural systems how do you do this, right? I mean, you can't take you can't take petrochemicals out of the equation, because literally 50% of the world population depends on us farming with petrochemicals. So any kind of transition will be slow and arduous, and the political process so far fails to recognize the enormous risk that is ahead of us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Klaus. Thank you. Joshua?
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank you, Klaus, because I think your presentation was incredibly coherent and deep. I think it's a really important perspective, and I think in terms of what we're trying to do with Holos, in terms of the Alliance, these presentations, which are crucial to creating a sustainable future and promoting these ideas and this level of intelligence is so important. So my first point is to thank you, because what we've seen tonight is just not even the tip of the iceberg of the work that you've done. So thank you. The next point I want to come to is, where does the security risk come from? And I'd like to look at this in a couple of ways and see what you think, and especially in the context of both what Michael and Glenn have shared. If you look back at farming in different places, we have had a completely different relationship to the production of food in the past, and the use of labor and the conscription of labor has been done in many different ways, from slavery to feudalism and so on. And today we have almost no involvement as ordinary citizens, certainly in the UK, in the farming sector. I know it's different in France because there's a lot of the land holding system is different, and in Italy probably. But it seems to me that we are so disconnected. That is a key issue. And maybe the other key issue is the key sustainability risk, security risk, and resilience risk is in the way that our economy and our politics works. So that is to say that our democracy and our way of measuring prosperity are actually huge contributors to this. What I'm trying to get to is that if instead of the current economic system extracting the value from the assets that we have and turning it into dead digits in absentee landlords or absentee corporate shareholders' bank accounts, we were actually to structure our local politics and our global politics around our assets and strengths. And those assets are many of the things that you've spoken about, clean water and fertile soils, but also about the creativity and contribution that ordinary people can make. And what I'm coming to really is the idea of an asset-based political economy that ring fences the needs of sustainability, the needs of communities, the needs of humanity, the needs of biodiversity, can possibly be a holistic perspective that can impact the very structures that are undermining the sustainability that you speak about and the future of humanity, basically.
Mm. Mm. Thank you, Joshua. Just to mention that with us tonight, we've got Richard Cox. And Richard Cox is an expert on Smuts and on Goethe and on helping folks to actually see the living patterns, the patterns of living systems. And he will be addressing us later this year so that we can actually start to make that reconnection with nature that you spoke about, Joshua. We've now reached about the end of our time. And Aaron, I see your hand up again.
Sorry, just one thought came to my mind. So you mentioned the word system and transformation, Klaus. Now, I think from what we have experienced in the past decades or centennials is that transformation of existing systems is not so easy. And that what usually works quite well is to just build a new that makes the old one obsolete. How do you see this in this regard?
So I'm a great fan of Donella Meadows, the leverage points, where to intervene in a system, leverage points of a system. Mm-hmm. See, the most often the conversation happens where we are at the top, right, at the narrative level, and it fails to reach the bureaucrats and the farmers, and the siloed members of the economy that don't see the whole picture, but they don't understand why you're asking them to do something different because they don't see the picture. So the idea, and then there is another thing, and these are actually what my agents are trained on, the AI. And then the other part of that is spiral dynamics. So you're changing your language, depending on who in this pyramid you're having a conversation with. Because a farmer speaks a different language than a soil scientist. So how do we merge that, and what kind of translations are necessary? So the AI that we have trained up on this is intuitively adjusting the way it speaks with you based on your worldview. It identifies where you are at, and modifies it. And I think that because individually this is a really hard thing to do, but to the AI it comes fluently. So we are using this model. So I even mentioned to the AI, I would like you to help me draft this communication and write it in blue, right? And because the biodynamics has this simplified way of speaking in colors. And so I think that's where it is. You can't bypass the system. You can't create a new system at scale. We're talking about a trillion-dollar sector of the economy. It has to come together. That means we have to have a blueprint. We have to have a vision, right? And that vision needs to be able to be communicated. So you start at the narrative level, but then you translate this. What does this mean? 2, 3, 4 levels down. How does that translate? So that's the way I am approaching it. Yeah.
Yes, thank you.
And so it is Echon that said we should call this section of the festival the liminal space. Exploring, rethinking, imagining. I see your hand, Mark.
Yeah, I want to make two related points. It's hard for me to always keep clear whether I'm thinking in terms of a mechanical system or a living system. And they are fundamentally, profoundly incommensurate. So that said, as a prelude to the second point, societies and businesses and governments are living systems. They're not mechanical systems. And living systems all inhabit the growth curve, which I call the death curve to make the key point. All living systems cross-link and ultimately become unfit for the changing environment. What does that mean? That means that every business and every government needs to die. Now, every human being dies, but society doesn't die. We keep having children. What we don't know how to do with businesses and governments is to have children and let the old thing die. We only know how to die in revolutions. And what we need to figure out is how can the living systems we call companies, institutions, governments, how can we gracefully have them die at the same time their siblings are being created? Now, that is not commensurate with any idea I've ever heard for a nation state, which were all created to create boundaries and expand boundaries and own stuff, basically so you could have soldiers, so you could own more shit. So it's not really commensurate with the origins of nation states, but everything I say still is true. So yeah, next call, just tell me how to do this.
We've reached the end of our time here. It's been very generative. I do want to mention that our next gathering on the 12th of August is where we look at AI specifically, the role of the future of humanity and AI. And Klaus, if you can join us for that, that'll be so wonderful. Professor George Revsky has already provided a paper. He's an authority on that field. It's somehow in the holistic model, we have to see AI and technology as part of that, functional part of that. And Klaus, you've described that very beautifully. It's a great pleasure to have listened to you. It's been provocative, thought-provoking, and we will be curating your presentation. You will be writing an article that will eventually be published in the journal, and the material will be up on the website. So a great vote of thanks to you, Klaus. Thank you so much.
Claudius, if I may just mention, I have been working as a research fellow with the Schumacher Institute on a project called CHI, Collaborative Hybrid Intelligence, to merge human and mechanical intelligence into a complementary relationship, into a hybrid relationship. That's a very relevant topic.
Excellent. Any further observations? It seems as though we've gotten there. Klaus, as they say here in Spain, muchas gracias.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And for those that participated, thank you so much for being here, and do stay in touch.